August 19, 1991. The Tamanskaya division rolls into Moscow. In our timeline, the coup fails, the tanks stop, and the Soviet Union disintegrates into 15 chaotic republics. But the margin between collapse and survival was not a matter of destiny. It was a matter of logistics. If the State Committee on the State of Emergency had severed the telephone lines to the Russian White House 3 hours earlier, or if the Alpha Group had executed their arrest orders with the ruthlessness of 1956 Budapest, the political dissolution would have been halted. But political survival does not print money. The Soviet Union of 1991 was technically bankrupt. To survive past the 1990s, a surviving USSR would have faced an economic equation so brutal it makes the Great Depression look like a rounding error. Today, we are not telling a story of ideology. We are running a simulation based on the hard numbers of oil exports, grain tonnage, and sovereign debt. This is the timeline where the hammer and sickle never fell, and the price the world paid for it. To understand why the Soviet Union was on death's door, we must ignore the speeches and look at the ledger. By 1980, the USSR had transformed from a manufacturing superpower into a resource colony of the West, disguised as a rival. The Carnegie Endowment analysis of late Soviet economics reveals a terrifying dependency. By the mid-1980s, oil and gas accounted for roughly 80% of Soviet hard currency export revenues. They were pumping 603 million tons of crude out of Western Siberia annually. But where did that money go? It didn't go into computers. It didn't go into factories. It went into bread. The Soviet agricultural sector was a black hole. In 1970, net grain imports were 2.16 million tons. By 1985, that number had exploded by a factor of 20 to 44.2 million tons. The systemic reality was simple. The Soviet Union was selling oil to buy food. Bread had become a petroleum derivative. This effectively turned the superpower into a hedge fund, betting on the price of a single commodity. And in the 1980s, the market moved against them. The price of oil collapsed. According to S&P Global Platts data, the oil glut of the mid-80s slashed Soviet hard currency earnings by nearly half. Simultaneously, the purchasing power of that oil evaporated. In 1985, selling 1 barrel of Soviet crude bought a certain amount of Western German machine parts or American wheat. By 1988, you needed to sell 4 barrels to buy the exact same amount of goods. This is a terms of trade shock. The Politburo was attempting to maintain First World military spending and Second World consumption levels on Third World income. The math required borrowing. By 1989, Western banks were suffering from credit fatigue. The CIA's 1979 warning that hard currency shortages would constrain grain imports had come true. The system was insolvent. In our history, Gorbachev attempted to fix this through perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness. The combination was fatal. Openness allowed the public to complain about the restructuring. In our counterfactual scenario, we assume the hardliners understand the math. They realize that you cannot reform a command economy while allowing free speech. They look at the Chinese model of 1989, economic control plus violent political suppression. The simulation begins in August 1991. The coup succeeds. Gorbachev is placed under permanent house arrest. The borders are sealed. The question is no longer, how do we democratize? The question is, how do we feed 290 million people when the bank account is empty? Phase A, the clampdown. August 20, 1991. The GKCHP, State Committee, declares martial law. Unlike the hesitation of our timeline, here they deploy the Alpha Group to liquidate the leadership of the Russian Federation. Yeltsin is arrested. The media blackout is total. But tanks cannot harvest wheat. The immediate crisis is the 1991 harvest failure and the lack of hard currency to buy American grain. The US, naturally, imposes a total grain embargo. The new Soviet leadership faces a calorie deficit of roughly 30 million tonnes of grain. They have two choices: default on their sovereign debt to save cash for food, or starve the periphery to feed the cities. They choose the latter. This is the Holodomor logic applied to the industrial age. The military secures the grain-producing regions of Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Exports of food from these republics to the Baltics and the Caucasus are halted. Central planning reverts to a war footing. Ration cards are issued. 2,000 calories for workers in defence and energy, 1,200 for everyone else. The financial fallout is immediate. By formally retaining the Soviet structure, the state assumes all foreign debt obligations, roughly $68 billion owed to the West. With oil prices hovering around $18 a barrel, service payments consume 40% of export revenue. In late 1991, the USSR declares a unilateral debt moratorium. This freezes them out of global capital markets. There are no IMF loans, no World Bank aid. The economy is now a closed loop. The supply chain crisis hits the manufacturing sector first. Without German machine tools or Japanese microchips, the civilian industrial base grinds to a halt. The Lada factory doesn't just slow down, it stops. But the military-industrial complex is ring-fenced. The KGB's Economic Directorate takes direct control of all hard currency generating assets: oil, gas, diamonds, gold, and titanium. Everything else is left to rot. The geopolitical cost of survival is isolation. In the Baltics, the independence movements are crushed with Tiananmen-level force. This triggers strict Western sanctions comparable to those on Iran or North Korea. Technology transfer is banned. The COCOM, Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, list is expanded. This creates a fork in the technological timeline. While the West begins the 1990s IT boom, the USSR is forced to cannibalize its existing mainframe infrastructure. They have no access to Intel or Microsoft. The Soviet computer scientists are conscripted into a crash program to reverse engineer 1980s Western chips. They succeed in maintaining basic functionality for military systems, but the civilian economy begins to demodernize. The average Soviet citizen in 1993 has less access to technology than they did in 1985. By 1993, the immediate political threat is neutralized, but the standard of living has collapsed by 40%. This is the North Koreanization of the USSR. To prevent revolt, the internal security budget is tripled. The KGB is not disbanded, it is expanded. They implement a system of internal passports and checkpoints to prevent migration from the starving provinces to Moscow. The social contract has changed. It is no longer, we pretend to work and you pretend to pay us. It is now, we feed you enough to work and you don't go to the gulag. It is brutal, but logistically it holds. The state retains control of the pipelines. As long as gas flows to Western Europe, who, despite their rhetoric, refuse to cut off Soviet gas due to their own energy needs, the regime has a lifeline. Phase B, the long winter. The mid-1990s. In our timeline, this was the era of the Wild East, oligarchs and chaos. In this timeline, it is the era of the grey stagnation. The pivotal variable here is the oil price crash of 1998, dropping to $12 a barrel. For a petro-state under sanctions, this should be fatal. But the Soviet economy of 1998 is different from 1991. It has already shed its fat. It has no consumer imports to cut. The regime survives by defaulting on its domestic obligations. They stop paying wages in rubles and start paying in-kind rations or company scrip. The ruble becomes effectively worthless for international trade, used only for internal accounting. This creates a barter economy for the population, while the state hoards every cent of foreign currency. There are no oligarchs buying yachts in London. The wealth is concentrated entirely within the party elite and the security services. It is during this period of extreme scarcity that the USSR attempts its moonshot, the resurrection of cybernetic planning. Unable to afford market inefficiencies, they look back to Stafford Beer's Project Cybersyn in Chile and the Soviet OGAS proposals of the 1960s. They don't have the internet. They build the Gosset, StateNet. It is not a web for information, it is a digital nervous system for logistics. Every factory, mine, and collective farm is connected via fiber optic lines to the Moscow mainframe. The goal is real-time inventory tracking to eliminate hoarding. In theory, this optimizes the economy. In practice, it encounters the garbage in, garbage out problem. Factory managers, terrified of purges, input false data into the terminals. The computer says there is a surplus of steel in Chelyabinsk, so the train is sent. But the steel doesn't exist. The logic of the algorithm clashes with the logic of survival. The system prevents total collapse by managing critical shortages, but it cannot create growth. It merely digitizes the poverty. The Chechen War still happens in 1994, but it looks different. In our timeline, a disorganized Russian army suffered humiliating defeats. In this timeline, the Red Army is demoralized, but retains its command structure and heavy doctrine. There is no independent media to report on the casualties. The Soviet Air Force levels Grozny with thermobaric weapons in weeks, not months. The cost is high, thousands of conscripts dead. But the message to the other republics is clear. Separation means annihilation. This preserves the territorial integrity of the Union, but it creates a permanent insurgency in the Caucasus. The USSR of the late 90s is a garrison state, bleeding men and money to hold its borders, much like the late Ottoman Empire. They are surviving, but they are calcifying. By the end of the millennium, the divergence is stark. The West is experiencing the dot-com boom, an explosion of wealth and connectivity. The Soviet Bloc is a digital island. They have missed the browser revolution, the e-commerce revolution, and the mobile phone revolution. A Soviet citizen in 1999 might have a communicator, a clunky, state-monitored device for text messaging, but no access to the World Wide Web. The GDP gap widens to an abyss. The US economy is growing at 4% annually. The Soviet economy is stagnant. But, crucially, the population has stabilised. The weak have died or fled. The survivors have adapted to the austerity. The system has reached a grim equilibrium. And then, geology deals them a winning hand. Phase C, the hydrocarbon injection. From 2000 to 2008, the price of oil skyrockets, peaking at $147 a barrel. In our timeline, this fueled Putin's rise and a consumer boom in Russia. In the Soviet timeline, this influx of cash is astronomical relative to their austere budget. The state suddenly has hundreds of billions in surplus hard currency. The Politburo faces a choice: liberalize consumption or fortify the system. They choose the latter. They pay off the 1990s debts to exit the sanctions regime partially. They upgrade the energy infrastructure. But most importantly, they invest in the Great Soviet Firewall. They realize the internet is an existential threat. They build a parallel internet, Red Web, physically disconnected from the global net except for heavily monitored gateways. It offers state-approved equivalents: Soyuz Tube for video, vContact for social tracking. It works because the population has never known the alternative. Geopolitically, the 2000s are the decade of the energy superpower. The USSR leverages its gas reserves to drive a wedge between Europe and the US. They offer Germany long-term gas contracts at below-market rates in exchange for technology transfers. It works. German industry, hungry for cheap energy, lobbies against US sanctions. The Soviet Union effectively buys its way back into the global industrial supply chain, but strictly on state terms. Meanwhile, they look east. The rise of China is the perfect complement. China needs energy. The USSR needs consumer goods. A barter arrangement emerges. Siberian oil for Chinese electronics. This allows the Soviet Union to finally fill its store shelves with goods, televisions, microwaves, computers, without liberalizing its own economy. The Made in China sticker saves Soviet socialism from consumer revolt. With the oil money, the Cybersyn project finally gets the hardware it needs. By 2010, the Soviet economy is the world's first big data autocracy. They implement the electronic ruble, not a cryptocurrency, but a fully traceable digital central bank currency. Cash is abolished. Every transaction, from buying a loaf of bread to purchasing a turbine, is logged on the central mainframe. This eliminates the black market that plagued the old USSR. If you buy more inputs than your quota allows, the system automatically flags you. Tax evasion becomes impossible. Corruption doesn't disappear, but it becomes centralised. Only the elite with override codes can steal. For the average manager, the computer is an unblinking eye. This efficiency boost raises Soviet TFP, total factor productivity, growth to modest positive numbers. It's not a dynamic market, but it's a highly efficient jail. Phase D, the stagnation. The problem with a resource-dependent command economy is that it cannot innovate. By the 2010s, the global economy shifts toward AI, biotech, and renewable energy. The USSR is left behind. They can drill oil efficiently, but they cannot invent the iPhone. Their Red Web clones Western apps, but lacks the creative destruction that drives progress. The brain drain is catastrophic. Despite the closed borders, the brightest minds risk death to cross into Finland or Turkey. The Soviet population is aging rapidly. The demographics are terminal. The cohort born during the hungry years of the 1990s is too small to support the pensioners. The state responds by raising the retirement age and cutting social services, blaming capitalist imperialism for the austerity. The social contract begins to fray again. Crucially, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 never happens. Why? Because Ukraine is already inside the house. It is a Soviet republic, albeit a rebellious and heavily policed one. There is no NATO expansion to Kyiv because the USSR never left. However, the cost of occupation is bleeding the budget dry. The USSR of the 2020s is spending 25% of its GDP on security and defence. It is a giant North Korea spanning 11 time zones. The green energy transition in the West poses the ultimate threat. As Europe moves to wind and solar, demand for Soviet gas softens. The math of the 1980s begins to return. The oil price is no longer the saviour. The regime realises it is trapped in a race against time. Can they automate their economy fully before their main export becomes obsolete? So, what does the world look like today in 2026? We see a tripolar order. The Western Alliance, US, EU, Japan, Korea, controls the high-tech service economy and the open seas. China dominates global manufacturing. And the Soviet Union is the resource fortress of the North. The USSR controls the Arctic route, which has become a vital shipping lane due to climate change, giving them a new geopolitical card to play. The borders are hard. Crossing from Poland, EU, into Belarus, USSR, is like crossing the DMZ in Korea. There is no tourism. There is no cultural exchange. The Iron Curtain has been replaced by the Silicon Curtain. Economically, the average Soviet citizen in 2026 lives a life comparable to 2005 Russia, but with less freedom and more stability. Housing is free but dilapidated. Healthcare is universal but primitive. Food is abundant but low quality. There is no extreme poverty, but no upward mobility. The state provides a floor, but imposes a low ceiling. The Splinternet means a Soviet teenager in Moscow plays state-approved video games, listens to state-approved rap, and chats on state-monitored networks. They know the West exists, but they view it through a filter of propaganda, describing it as a chaotic, decadent war zone. The truth is a contraband commodity. But beneath the surface stability, the math is crumbling again. The Soviet model of 2026 is built on hydrocarbon rents. As the world accelerates toward net zero emissions by 2050, the USSR faces a terminal decline. They have failed to diversify. Their cybernetic planning optimized the old industrial economy, but it could not build a new one. They are efficient at making tanks and drilling gas, but useless at biotech and green tech. The system is brittle. A sustained drop in oil prices below $40 would trigger the 1991 crisis all over again. They have survived for 35 extra years, but they have not solved the fundamental flaw. You cannot run a superpower on resource extraction alone. The Soviet Union could have survived. The logistics were there. The repression was available. The oil was in the ground. But the result would not have been a socialist utopia. It would have been a stagnating, digital prison camp, spanning a sixth of the Earth's land surface. A zombie empire kept alive by oil prices and fibre optics. We look at the collapse of 1991 as a tragedy or a triumph, depending on your politics. But economically, it was a correction. It was the market liquidating a bankrupt firm. By preventing that liquidation, our counterfactual USSR merely delayed the pain, amortizing the collapse over 3 decades of grey stagnation. They bought survival with potential. They traded the future for the present. And this brings us to the present. Because the logic of the petro-state trap isn't history, it is the operating system of half the world today. Look at the Gulf states trying to diversify before the oil runs out. Look at Russia's current pivot to a war economy. Look at China's surveillance state. They are all trying to solve the equation that the Soviet Union failed to balance. How to maintain authoritarian control in a world that requires open information for economic growth. The math is getting harder. The oil is getting harder to extract. And the population is getting older. If you want to understand the physics of these systems, not the propaganda, but the supply chain math that dictates their survival or collapse, you need to subscribe. We don't do politics here, we do the audit. Class dismissed.